The last paper will be delivered by Leo Kershaw, a PhD student at Oxford. He focuses largely on the reception of classical literature, and he considers aspects of gender, identity, and colonial criticism. And today he will deliver a paper on gender fluidity in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and more specifically in the Tiresias episode. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about Tiresian Metabolē, and specifically gender fluidity in Ovid's Metamorphoses and its reception in the poetry of KaeT. The ideological function of myth that is used to explain complex and elusive aspects of ever-changing human identity manifests clearly in Ovid's Metamorphoses, an epic poem that purports in its opening lines to recount four mass figures changed into nova corpora, new bodies. While the majority of Ovid's episodes of Metamorphoses concern transformations whereby characters lose aspects of their humanity, 6 of his accounts describe individuals who undergo a change of gender but maintain their human identity: Scython, Mestra, Caeneus, Iphis, Hermaphroditus, and Tiresias. While the gender fluidity of Scython and Mestra is mentioned only in passing, and the binary transitions of Caeneus and Iphis represent a wish fulfillment, the myths of Hermaphroditus and Tiresias manifest the complexities of fluctuating gender identities and bodies. Ovid consciously refashions Tiresias' Metamorphoses into an account that emphasizes the transformation of his sexed body. As a rich source offering foundation myths for gender fluidity, modern poets have turned to the Metamorphoses to consider narratives of androgynous, transgender, and intersex individuals who see their bodies transformed into something that reflects or contradicts their inner identity. However, the density of Ovid's account of Tiresias, which is consolidated from classical and Hellenistic tragedy, poetry, and mythography into merely 9 lines, has left ample room for poetic exploration of Tiresias' ambiguous gender identity. In their 2014 thematic anthology, Hold Your Own, the non-binary poet, rapper, playwright, and spoken word artist, KaeT, draws upon this potential in the myth of Tiresias to explore the painful incongruence between the sex body and gender identity, particularly when the latter is fluid, entrapped within a binary body. Tempest interrogates the gender identity, the dysphoria, hatred, confusion, and joy that arises from a body characterized by fluidity rather than impenetrable boundaries, and the figure of Tiresias permeates their poetry as a vehicle for expressing the emotional turbulence inherent in the perception, experience, and incongruity of protean gender identity. Tempest therefore expands Ovid's transformation myth of the prophet Tiresias into a transgender narrative that interweaves elements of autobiography, mythology, plurality, and individuality. Experiencing successive changes in sex and gendered appearance, there Tiresias oscillates between 2 bodily forms, but underlying this somatic metamorphosis is a persistent sense of innate androgyny, which forms the true explanation for Tiresias' magical transformations. Following a disagreement between Juno and Jupiter as to whether women or men derive greater pleasure from sex, they resolve to ask Tiresias. Ovid writes, "Both sides of love were known to him. For once, with a blow of his staff, he had violated 2 huge serpents mating in the green forest. And, incredibly, he was changed from man to woman, and in that form spent 7 years. In the 8th year, he saw the same serpents again, and said, 'Since in striking you there is such magic power as to change the condition of the giver of the blow to the opposite, now I will strike you once again.' So saying, he struck the serpents, and his prior form was restored, and his original appearance returned." Working within a context of multiple extant Tiresias stories, variants of which are attributed to Pseudo-Hesiod, Callimachus, and Sostratus, Ovid consciously refashions Tiresias' metamorphosis into an account which emphasizes the transformation of his sex body, but not necessarily his gendered identity. He is described as unique in that he knows both sides of love, Venus huic erat, utraque nota. Importantly, utra denotes a binary which Tiresias miraculously transgresses, deque vero factus Metabolē femina. The close juxtaposition of ver and femina, as Genevieve Lively has noted, suggests that these ostensible distinctions between sexes are perhaps neighboring rather than opposing, which allows for Tiresias' strikingly easy transition. However, While the Ovidian Tiresias' body may be characterized by fluidity rather than sharp, impermeable boundaries, it is, significantly, only Tiresias' body that is affected. The metamorphosis pertains specifically to his outward appearance, his forma and imago, focalizing the reader's attention on the externalized and typically most static indicators of identity. This focus is surely due to Ovid's introduction of Tiresias in a sexual context. Not only does his bodily transformation occur as a result of observing two snakes copulating coeuntia, but because of his experience of Venus Utra in the respective bodies of both a man and a woman, he is called upon by Jupiter and Juno to determine which sex derives the most pleasure for voluptas from intercourse. As Elena Giusti has observed, Ovid never lingers on a transgender portrait of the seer. The story is dependent not so much on Tiresias' experience of changed gender, but of differently sexed bodies, which explain his role in the narrative, to offer an empirical judgment concerning sexual pleasure. Tempest, however, in their poem Tiresias, insinuates a shift in gendered identity in accompaniment with bodily transformation. Permeating Hold Your Own is an exploration of the changing body, both willed by the individual and magically altered by an apparently divine force, as in Ovid. Tiresias' first metamorphosis is his body responding to something beyond him, and as his shape moves, his body pours itself into puddles. The metaphorical liquidity reflects a fluidity of identity that runs deeper than a mere bodily transformation. Indeed, the change in his body triggers a change in gender. As Tempest writes, he will be more than the sum of his parts. Implicit is a gender-fluid individual who sheds their masculine identity, which exists in tandem with a feminine identity, upon assumption of a female body. This figure turns and retreats, finds herself deep. It's as if this is all she had known. The impression that Tiresias' new womanly form corresponds with her female identity emerges clearly in the poem entitled The Woman Tiresias, who initially dragged her shape around like chains, questioning, was it real or was it magic? Alluding to the mythical metamorphosis that Ovid's Tiresias undergoes, Tempest reinterprets the character's transformation as the self-determined transition of a transgender individual who tries to reconcile her wants with what she knew she was. When transformed in the poem The Man Tiresias back into a male body, Tiresias witnesses all that he'd learned to be true fall to pieces and watches his body, his new shape, like it isn't his. In exploring the emotions and feelings and the agony of transition, Tempest presents Tiresias' metamorphosis as a narrative of gender fluidity, not merely a translocation into a differently sexed body, as in Ovid. While the Tiresias of Ovid primarily, if not solely, experiences two versions of the sexed body, this bodily fluidity for the Tiresias of Tempest encompasses a fluidity of identity. Tempest describes their fascination with Tiresias as a character they first encountered in Sophoclean tragedy, who was never really explained, and in their epic-inspired response, as Henry Stead has summarized, Tempest crystallizes the complex emotional turbulence of shifting understandings of the growing self, particularly, but not exclusively, in terms of gender identity. Experiencing successive changes in sex, their Tiresias is torn between two corporal forms, but underlying this somatic metamorphosis is a persistent sense of innate androgyny, which forms the true explanation for Tiresias' magical transformations. Throughout the poems in their anthology, Tempest explores the constrictive role of the sexed body, which stifles the expression of gender identity and is unable to conform to gendered expectations, thereby failing to do justice to Tiresias' fluctuating gender. The poem Tiresias can certainly be read as a trans narrative, whose protagonist, prior to their magical transformation into a girl, lives with a dullness inside, born of desires left unsatisfied. Confined within an adolescent male body, Tiresias is either stifled or awkwardly learning the ways of his times, but either way, spends his time hating himself. That he walks to school swinging his hips, a description typically applied to women, is a subtle suggestion that he harbors at least an element of femininity, which is otherwise restricted by his limbs that are awkward. A phrase that may not only refer to a growing pubescent teenager, but an individual whose body is incongruent with their gender. Ed Maddon has drawn attention to the fact that images of voice in Tiresian texts are specifically grounded in transgendered or queered bodies. The multiple gendered identities residing within Tiresias appear clearly in the poem The Woman Tiresias, where the boy in her is strong some days and calls out for a girl to touch. The girl in her is full of rage and craves the things she hates so much. It is not simply Tiresias' body that breaks in two, but her gender identity seems to fluctuate between woman and man, filling the absence in Ovid's account with a powerful transgender narrative. Furthermore, a sense of dysphoria derived from this discontinuity between sex and gender is perceptible in the poem The Woman the Boy Became. Tempest writes, "When she puts her hands down and feels what's beneath, she feels all the grief of the world. If what's beneath is understood as the corporeal form, the subject's grief is a poignant expression of gender dysphoria, the sensation of extreme discomfort upon the perception of a dissimilarity between one's sex and one's gender." An emphasis on bodily discomfort pervades Tempest's Tiresian poems, whose man Tiresias, upon being transformed back into a boy, finds his grief a burden to keep, watching his body like it isn't his, and whose woman Tiresias worries about her shape, dragged around like chains. The imagery of shackles powerfully conveys the idea of the body as a form of imprisonment, which cannot, without the assistance of magical forces, express the same fluidity as gender. When the woman Tiresias questions whether she can be more than sex and body, Tempest highlights that in a world which only recognizes a binary sexed body, the fluidity within Tiresian individuals is constrained by the inflexibility of the sexed body. In developing the emotional fluctuation that occurs because or in spite of Tiresias' shifting sex, Tempest infuses the prophet's story with a sense of gender fluidity that is not as prominent in Ovid's retelling of the myth. Drawing predominantly upon the Hesiodic version summarized in Eustathius' commentary on the Odyssey, whose Tiresias is chosen as a judge, KaeT, because of his experience of two sexes, digenes, Ovid presents a very different account from that allegedly offered by Sostratus in the elegiac poem Tiresias, whose character undergoes 6 changes of sex before passing into the form of a mouse. James O'Hara suggests that Sostratus' Tiresias influenced Catullus' exploration of Attis's ambiguous gender identity in his 63rd poem, where, having undergone multiple changes of appearance, figurae, Attis questions, ego mulia, ego adolescens, ego ephebus, ego puer. Am I a woman, a young man, and a Phoebe, a boy? The fluidity of Attis's sexed form leaves them uncertain about their gender, lacking a concrete sense of self. No such reflection upon gender identity is found in Ovid's condensed story of Tiresias, but Tempest adds this dimension to their Tiresian poetry. Victoria Rimmel argues that Tempest's Tiresias performs gender fluidity as a psychophysical torture and ecstasy, chucking a series of small hand grenades towards the contemporary nexus of feminisms and trans politics. The language of performing gender is drawn from Judith Butler's notion that gender does not actually exist, but that there is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender, that identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. However, the emotional force behind Tiresias' gendered struggle to assimilate into society and the turmoil that appears to stem from inner conflict strongly suggests that Tiresias is experiencing rather than performing an identity in flux. The protagonist in the poem The Woman the Boy Became questions, how many yous have you been? How many? Lined up inside, each killing the last. The yous can be construed as the variously gendered strands of Tiresias' identity, between which the character fluctuates, splitting into multiples when unable to express them all at once. The direct address creates a synthetic personalization with the reader, and as Anna Valles-Beniat observes, Tempest makes the myth our own, allowing the reader to travel with Tiresias in a transgender body. The tempestuous emotions resident in the actualization of this fluidity are expressed in the kaleidoscopic blur of delight and pain that Tiresias experiences when transformed a second time. Finding her throat open, screaming, her body stops. She feels his might, his veins thicken in intense delight. A man again, he stands confused. There is a simultaneous discomfort in this pain, this change, this awe, this screaming and confusion, and an almost inexplicable sense of pleasure and intense delight in the lack of stability. When Tiresias is confined to a binary gender, unable to reconcile her wants with what she knew she was, she appears most dysphoric. But when fluidity prevails, when Tiresias has a body that is warm and unending, only then is there a perceptible sense of ease and authenticity, encapsulated in the poem Man Down. Be all that you are, all woman, all soft, all man, all soft, all flesh, all bone, all organ. I find you more than yourself. So to conclude, Ovid's brief account of Tiresias' sex transformation has, therefore, allowed for a rich poetic interpretation and augmentation of mythological gender fluidity. Tempest transfuses their semi-autobiographical retelling of the prophet's journey with an emotionally charged, constantly fluctuating development of gendered identity. their sex body sometimes acts as a cage which prevents Tiresias from embodying their true self, but at other times, in its very malleability, enables its subject to explore the complex, sometimes contradictory, elements of their identity. Ovid's Metamorphoses shows that gender, that ostensibly immutable binary, can be fluid and subject to change, creating great potential for poetic reception of myths of gender nonconformity. Tempest, indeed, infuses their retelling of the Tiresian transformation with an overt awareness of the implications of gender fluidity upon the identity of their subject, creating ample opportunity for the reader to elicit their own meaning from the adaptation, especially from a transgender perspective. As Tempest themselves summarizes, while they are personal, the beauty of a poem is that it has a life beyond the sum of its words. So reading about one moment in my life can become a moment in yours. Their modern response to the myth of classical antiquity invites the reader to share in the experience of a contemporary Tiresias who harbors a gender fluidity and a constant state of Metabolē that transcends the contrariae formae of Ovid. Thank you very much.